Alright, we're doing Chapter 6, Learning. So, learning is a change in an organism's behavior or thought as a result of experience. So basically, all of our behaviors are a complex mix of genetic predispositions and learning. Habituation is the process of responding less strongly over time to repeated stimuli. This is why we don't consciously see our nose unless we focus on it. This is the no, never mind. So from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. We don't want to consciously attend to every single thing because we may miss a possible threat, yet we wouldn't want to habituate to something dangerous. This is why scientists believe this is one of the oldest forms of learning in humans. So, since we don't want to habituate to something dangerous, not all repeated stimuli result in habituation. So some events of repeated exposure result in sensitization, which is a heightened response over time, and this is the opposite of habituation. Classical conditioning. Yes, it's time for that lecture. This is based on the premise of us experiencing a stimulus, responding to it, and then stop responding after repeated exposure. So a lot of learning depends on associations between stimuli. If we never learned how to use associations to our advantage, our world would be a series of disconnected experiences. So in the 19th century, a group of old dudes in England believed we learned everything through conditioning. I say old dudes because back then women didn't really have a place in the field, so they might think her a witch for knowing math. So Pavlov's classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is a form of learning in which animals respond to a previously neutral stimulus that had been paired with another stimulus that elicits an automatic response. So attempts have been made to transfer this to humans, and the early attempts weren't exactly ethical. Like, remember little Albert? This concept should sound familiar, as should the researcher Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov conditioned dogs to salivate at the sound of a metronome. Yes, metronome, not bell. Classical conditioning is sometimes referred to as Pavlovian conditioning because of these findings. So his early attempts were anecdotal, so like a good scientist, he began to attempt replication with an experimental design. He started with a neutral stimulus, in this case, a metronome. He then paired this with an unconditioned stimulus, which is a stimulus that elicits an automatic response. In this case, it was meat powder. The automatic response elicited is an unconditioned response, which is an automatic response to a non-neutral stimulus that does not need to be learned. So if a dog smells something tasty, they're going to salivate. They don't have to learn how to do that. And in this case, the unconditioned response was salivation. The big thing here is that the salivation did not have to be learned. The dogs naturally salivated for the meat powder. And lastly, he paired the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus repeatedly. Eventually, he removed the unconditioned stimulus, but the dogs still responded the same way. This resulted in what's called a conditioned response, which is a response previously associated with a non-neutral stimulus that is elicited by a neutral stimulus through conditioning. Fun fact, this phenomenon may not even require the animal to be conscious. Some research has found that those in vegetative state can still be conditioned. So, and I included a link here to a YouTube video to one of my favorite portrayals of classical conditioning in media. It's from The Office. It's where Jim conditions Dwight to want a mint after the sound of a Windows computer rebooting. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it, and it's really a great example of this. So, principles of classical conditioning. There are 5. So first is acquisition. This is the learning phase during which a conditioned response is established. As the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired repeatedly, the conditioned response will become stronger. The faster the conditioned response and unconditioned stimulus appear in relation to each other, the quicker learning occurs. This is why when you're trying to teach an animal something, it's best to give them a treat immediately after they perform the behavior. Now we have backwards conditioning, which is unconditioned stimulus before the conditioned stimulus. And this is really, really hard to achieve. The second principle is extinction, which is the gradual reduction and eventual elimination of the conditioned response after the conditioned stimulus is presented repeatedly without the unconditioned stimulus. This can be likened to habituation, but they are separate phenomena. Extinction is an active process, while habituation is a passive process. Third, we have spontaneous recovery, which is sudden reemergence of an extinct conditioned response after a delay in the exposure to the conditioned stimulus. A similar phenomenon is the renewal effect, which is the sudden reemergence of a conditioned response following extinction when an animal is returned to the environment in which the conditioned response was acquired. And this could help explain why why people with phobias, which are intense irrational fears, experience the reappearance of their symptoms when they return to the environment in which they acquired their fears. Next, we have stimulus generalization. This is the process by which conditioned stimuli similar but not identical to the original conditioned response elicit a conditioned response. This occurs along a gradient, meaning that the more similar to the original conditioned stimulus the new stimulus is, the stronger the conditioned response will be. Next, we have stimulus discrimination. This is the process by which organisms display a less pronounced conditioned response to conditioned stimuli that differ from the original conditioned stimulus. Under this, an example would be higher order conditioning. This is related to this would be higher order conditioning. This is the process of developing a conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus by virtue of its association with another conditioned stimulus. For example, if a circle was presented with a tone for Pavlov's dogs, that could become a conditioned response as well. And this possibly explains why we get hungry when watching cooking shows. This is also involved in a lot of addictions, with the context or setting of drug use becomes the higher order conditioned response, i.e. social drinkers or people who smoke when they go out to bars. So without classical conditioning, we couldn't develop physiological associations to stimuli that signal biologically important events, such as things we want to eat or things that want to eat us. So classical conditioning actually has a lot of applications, especially in the media. The big one is advertising. So advertisers are some of the best at applying psychological theories, especially classical conditioning. Like marketing is basically a type of psychology. By repeatedly pairing the sights and sounds of products with photographs of handsome dudes or scantily clad ladies, advertisers seek to establish classically conditioned connections in our brains. The wild thing is that it works. And so does pairing a product with a celebrity. Even medication companies do this. I have an example of a Prozac advertisement right here. So why do you think antidepressant commercials are always very upbeat at the end? They want us to associate their product with happiness. So this conditioning works a little differently. This actually plays on our ability to read facial cues and what emotions we attribute to those facial cues. For example, we associate smiling with happiness. Therefore, if we see someone smiling while talking about a product, the happiness associated with smiling is then associated with that product. So another application is latent inhibition, which is a difficulty establishing classical conditioning to a conditioned stimulus we've already experienced alone, that is, without the unconditioned stimulus. This is often used as a competing explanation as to why some classical conditioning doesn't take place. For example, not all cereal commercials are successful in implementing classical conditioning in their commercials. Like, you've never seen a Raisin Bran commercial. Nothing wrong with Raisin Bran. I mean, have you ever seen a Raisin Bran commercial? I haven't. But like Fruit Loops, Trix, Honeycombs, like all like the kid cereals, all of those implement it, but some companies are just better at implementing it than others. So another application is fears and phobias. So Watson, the founder of behaviorism, believed classical conditioning could potentially explain how we acquire fears and phobias. So behaviorism is the theory that human and animal behavior can be explained in terms of conditioning without appeal to thoughts or feelings, and that psychological disorders are best treated by altering a behavior pattern. Yeah, this is the same Watson from the Little Albert study. However, as unethical as that study was, it did support Watson's theory that classical conditioning is how we develop fears. So stimulus generalization like that seen with Albert, allows our learning to be very flexible, which is typically a good thing, but not always. So while this could potentially explain some of the stranger phobias like clowns, there is a competing argument regarding more common phobias, like being afraid of snakes. A lot of people are afraid of snakes, spiders, alligators, sharks, and a lot of other deadly animals. The competing explanation believes this has an evolutionary component. Why are people afraid of these animals? Because they could kill us. They could kill us. Deadsies. Some of them can eat us. Like, it makes sense to be afraid of them. A lot, especially before the invention of anti-venom in modern medicine, did kill people on a very regular basis. Yeah. An incident involving one of these it used to be a death sentence, like guaranteed. So again, this fears of these creatures is very warranted. However, even though classical conditioning may be involved in the acquisition of phobias, it can also help us to overcome them. This involves pairing the feared stimulus with a feeling of relaxation or pleasure. And over here to the left, I just found a little infographic of the most common fears. As you can see, snakes, spiders, mice. Mice carried the Black Plague. Technically, it was fleas, but the fleas lived on the mice. You get what I mean. Darkness, blood, flying on an airplane, because, of course, 9/11 instilled the fear of death through an airplane crash in a lot of people. Being closed in a small space, suffocation. So, a lot of these you can make, like, a rational, biological explanation for, like, how these could be based in evolution. Another application is fetishes and disgust reactions. So a fetish is a sexual attraction to a non-living thing. One example could be feet or high heel shoes or something of that variety. One study actually classically conditioned male quails to develop a fetish for a cylindrical object. That was a real study conducted by actual scientists. As far as disgust reactions, scientists believe that these kind of reactions are the result of classical conditioning. The stimuli are ones biologically important to us, like food and life, and not profusely vomiting. Those are important. So classical conditioning helps keep us safe, even if it does go a little far sometimes. One study done by Armstrong and colleagues, which is uploaded with the slides on Blackboard, explores the relationship between conditioned disgust responses and contamination-based OCD. So contamination-based OCD is what the media typically portrays as extreme germaphobes. Like if you've ever seen the show Monk. Monk would have contamination-based OCD. And I do want to mention that not all cases of this disorder are as extreme. as the condition is often portrayed. You guys know, of course, media always likes to play things up, sensationalize. Not everyone with the disorder has it to that extreme of an extent. And remember, when it comes to psychology, the general public typically doesn't understand it very well. They rely a lot on popular psychology, especially people that work in Hollywood. So always keep that in mind when you see psychological phenomenon or something of the sort portrayed in media. Another variety of conditioning is operant conditioning, which is learning controlled by the consequences of an organism's behavior. This is commonly referred to as instrumental conditioning because the organism's response serves an instrumental function, and then the organism gets something out of this response, like food or avoiding something unpleasant. While I'm not a fan of SeaWorld, I do want to mention this is how they train their dolphins and orcas. This is how most people train animals in general. This is how you can train your dog to shake hands or teach your cat to play fetch. Behaviors produced by the organism to receive a reward are called operants because the animal operates on its environment to get what it wants. This is based largely on the law of effect. So the law of effect is a principle that asserts that if a stimulus followed by a behavior results in a reward, the stimulus is more likely to give rise to this behavior in the future. So, some psychologists refer to early behaviorism as S-R psychology, where S means stimulus and R means response. So it's stimulus-response psychology. These psychologists argue that most everything we do voluntarily results from gradual buildup of stimulus-response bonds due to the law of effect. So Thorndike found evidence to support that all learning, including human learning, was the result of trial and error. Hey, if I stick my finger in this electrical socket, it's going to zap me. I'm not going to stick my finger in that electrical socket. That sort of trial and error, kind of testing it out. Does it hurt? Does it help? How does it go? So B.F. Skinner wanted to improve upon Thorndike's experiment, so he built a Skinner box, which is a small animal chamber constructed by Skinner to allow sustained periods of conditioning to be administered and behaviors to be recorded unsupervised. So using this technique, Skinner studied reinforcement in rats, pigeons, and other animals and mapped out their responses to reward. So there are three main concepts in operant conditioning. You have reinforcement, punishment, and discriminative stimulus. So reinforcement is the outcome or consequence of a behavior that strengthens the probability of the behavior. And there are two types. There are positive and negative. So positive reinforcement would be the presentation of a stimulus that strengthens the probability of a behavior, whereas negative reinforcement is the removal of a stimulus that strengthens the probability of the behavior. So Skinner emphasizes that something is only reinforcement if the response is more likely to happen in the future. Punishment, on the other hand, is an outcome or consequence of a behavior that weakens the probability of the behavior. So this is distinctly different from negative reinforcement. Punishment weakens the response, whereas negative reinforcement strengthens it. So like reinforcement, there are positive and negative punishments. So positive punishment involves administering a stimulus the organism wants to avoid, whereas negative punishment involves the removal of a stimulus that the organism wishes to experience. As you can see here in this little foregrid, so if you add something and it increases a behavior, that's positive reinforcement. If you add something and it decreases a behavior, that's positive punishment. Remove something, increase a behavior, negative reinforcement. Remove something, decrease a behavior, negative punishment. So punishment is not exactly as people often refer to it in common use. So discipline is punishment only if it decreases the probability of the behavior. this is how these terms are thought of in popular culture. As we covered here, this is not the psychological use of punishment. While popular wisdom believes punishment usually works long term, Skinner believed that reinforcement worked much better than punishment. According to Skinner, punishment has several disadvantages. Punishment tells the organism only what not to do and not what they should be doing instead. So, a child who is punished for throwing a tantrum won't learn how to deal with frustration more constructively. This is why when correcting a child for throwing a tantrum, it's important to ask them to use their words and ask how they're feeling instead of just punishing them for having normal human emotions. Punishment often creates anxiety, which can interfere with future learning. Severe punishment as children is why many adults have anxiety. So while punishment may encourage subversive behavior, prompting people to become sneakier about situations in which they can and can't display forbidden behavior. So a child who's punished for grabbing his brother's toys may learn to grab his brother's toys only when his parents aren't looking, instead of learning to not grab his brother's toys. And this is part of why really strict parents tend to raise sneaky kids. Punishment from parents may provide a model for children's aggressive behavior as well. So, research has found a use of physical punishment on children tends to lead to aggressive behavior. While this correlation is up for debate, so take it with a grain of salt, it is important to consider. So, acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, stimulus generalization, and stimulus discrimination are all terms we've crossed paths with when discussing classical conditioning. 3 of them apply in operant conditioning as well. So first is extinction. In operant conditioning, extinction happens when we stop delivering reinforcers following a previously reinforced behavior. Gradually, this behavior declines in frequency and disappears. Shortly after withdrawing the reinforcer, the undesired behavior initially increases in intensity, probably because the child is trying to get reinforced. Second, we have stimulus discrimination. So, creatures can still be trained to distinguish between 2 different stimuli under operant conditioning, like the pigeons tried to differentiate between Monet and Picasso paintings. Third, we have stimulus generalization. So, the same pigeons would generalize their conditioning between Monet and other similar painters like Renoir. So, while they could tell the difference between 2 pretty distinct painters, they couldn't tell the difference between 2 similar painters. Right? So there are schedules of reinforcement, and these are basically just patterns of reinforcing a behavior. So continuous reinforcement is reinforcing a behavior every time it occurs, resulting in faster learning, but also faster extinction than only occasional reinforcement. So partial reinforcement is occasional reinforcement of a behavior, resulting in slower extinction than if the behavior had been reinforced continually. So most people's instinct would be to use continuous reinforcement, but Skinner's research shows that our instincts regarding reinforcement are backwards. Behaviors we partially reinforce are slower to extinguish than those we continually reinforce. And then there are 4 major schedules of reinforcements, and they vary along 2 dimensions. So they vary along consistency of administration. So some contingencies are fixed, whereas others are variable. That is, in some cases, reinforcement occurs on a regular basis, whereas in others, it occurs irregularly, so variably. Variable schedules tend to yield more consistent rates of responding than do fixed schedules. And schedules also vary along basis of administering reinforcement. So, some reinforcement schedules operate on ratio schedules, whereas others operate on interval schedules. In ratio schedules, the animal is reinforced on the basis of the number of responses that's emitted. In interval schedules, it's reinforced on the basis of the amount of time that has elapsed since the last reinforcement. So ratio schedules do tend to yield higher rates of responding than do interval schedules. The four main types, the first is a fixed ratio, or FR schedule, and it is the blue line here in the diagram. This is the pattern in which we provide reinforcement following a regular number of responses. Next, we have a variable ratio schedule, and this is a pattern in which we provide reinforcement after a specific number of responses on average, with the number varying randomly, and that's represented by the red line in the diagram. And these schedules usually yield the highest rates of responding. This is the tactic used by most casino machines to keep you coming back, to keep you spending money. Next, we have a fixed interval, or FI schedule. This is represented by the black line in the diagram. And this is a pattern in which we provide reinforcement for a response at least once following a specified time interval. This is especially distinctive in the behaviors they yield. This is associated with a scalloped pattern, which can be seen in the little loop-de-loop or Humpty Humps in the black line in the diagram. And this reflects the time an animal waits after receiving reinforcement and then increases its rate of responding just before the interval is up as it begins to anticipate reinforcement. Lastly, we have a variable interval, or VI schedule. This is shown by the green line in the diagram. And this is the pattern in which we provide reinforcement for a response at least once during an average time interval, with the interval varying randomly. So animal training is probably one of the biggest applications of operant conditioning. So as I mentioned earlier, conditioning is a very common practice used in animal training, especially in zoos, aquariums, circuses, working dogs, stuff like that. This is typically done using shaping, which is conditioning a target behavior by progressively reinforcing behaviors that come closer and closer to the target. Shaping reinforces behaviors that aren't exactly the target behavior, but are progressively close to it. Then they use fading, which is the decreasing the frequency of reinforcement of the not quite right behaviors over time. Animal trainers often combine shaping and chaining, which is where they link a number of interrelated behaviors to form a longer series. So if you've ever seen an animal perform in a zoo or an aquarium, that performance is the result of chaining. They learn each of those steps one at a time, and then gradually the trainers link them together. And each behavior in the chain becomes a cue for the next. And this is how animals are taught to perform routines. So it can also be, operant conditioning can also be applied to overcoming procrastination. So one of the best possible solutions was developed by Premack in his research on monkeys. He found that we can positively reinforce a less frequently performed behavior with a more frequently performed behavior. So this isn't foolproof, but it does typically work well and may help people to stop putting off things they've long avoided. So if you find yourself procrastinating, try to think of behaviors you'd typically perform if given the chance, like watching TV, getting a snack, and then reinforce yourself with these higher frequency behaviors only after you've completed the task. So completing your homework, doing a quiz, doing an exam. Operant conditioning can also be applied in therapy. So one of the most successful applications is the token economy. These are systems often set up in psychiatric hospitals for reinforcing appropriate behaviors and extinguishing inappropriate ones. So this is typically done by first identifying target behaviors that they hope to make more frequent. Staff members reinforce patients who perform these behaviors with tokens, chips, points, or other secondary reinforcers, which are neutral objects that become associated with a primary reinforcer. And a primary reinforcer is an item or outcome that naturally increases the target behavior. So token economies have been found to improve behavior in hospitals, group homes, and even juvenile facilities. Operant conditioning has also been helpful in treating autism spectrum disorder, especially in improving language deficits. So applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, makes extensive use of shaping techniques. So mental health providers use primary reinforcers like food as they reach progressively closer approximations to certain words and eventually complete sentences. So Lavas developed a promising technique for treating autism spectrum disorder, but since they didn't use random assignment, their results should be taken with a grain of salt. Because of the similarities between the two types of conditioning, some theorists believe they aren't as distinct as we once thought they were. So while there are some similarities, brain imaging has shown that the two techniques actually lead to activation in different regions of the brain. So classically conditioned fear reactions are often seen in the amygdala, whereas operant conditioning responses are based in areas high in dopamine, which is the, the reward circuit in our brain. The two-process theory tries to make peace between the two types of conditioning. So we need both to explain the persistence of anxiety disorders. First, people acquire phobias by means of classical conditioning. Then, once they develop phobias, they start to avoid their feared stimuli whenever they encounter them. When they avoid the stimuli, they are negatively reinforced. So by avoiding whatever is the center of their phobia, people can accidentally negatively reinforce themselves. Ironically, when they do this, they're operantly conditioning their fears to persist. So this theory points the way to an effective treatment for anxiety disorders, which is force people to confront rather than avoid their anxiety. So the main reason we haven't really discussed thought yet is because early learning psychologists focused primarily on behavioristic approaches. So it was an automatic process. There was no need for intervention by thought. It was just stimulus response. So Skinner advocated for what he called radical behaviorism, in which he believed observable behavior, thinking, and emotion are all governed by the same laws of learning. For radical behaviorists, thinking and emotion are behaviors. They're not separate. They're simply just more complex behaviors. They just aren't observable. So Skinner also believed that humans and other intelligent animals think, but he didn't believe thinking was any different in principle than other behaviors. And that led to what is called S-O-R psychology. So over the past few decades, psychology has moved further away from a simple stimulus response model to a more complex stimulus organism response model. So the SOR model believes the organism's response to a stimulus depends on what the stimulus means to the organism and is not automatic or mindless. These theorists believe classical and operant conditioning occur, but they believe that these forms of learning usually depend on thought. So conditioning under this framework is called cognitive conditioning, where our interpretation of the situation affects conditioning, suggesting that conditioning is far more than automatic, mindless process. These theorists also emphasize the role of expectations. So classical conditioning shows that organisms develop expectations about what's going to happen next. So to give you just kind of a visual, I made a little diagram for you here. So it goes stimulus, which is environmental stimuli, which leads to the organism. So emotional states like pleasure, arousal, dominance, which leads to a response. And this is typically viewed in a approach or avoid framework. So latent learning was pushed by Tolman, who believed reinforcement was not the end-all be-all of learning. So latent learning is learning that's not directly observable. We learn a lot of stuff without directly showing it. It is important to note, though, that there is a difference between competence, which is what we know, and performance, and this is showing what we know. So, for example, you might be a really good speller, but if you enter a spelling bee, you may not do well. And in that case, it would be high competence, low performance. And this distinction is important because it shows that reinforcement isn't necessary for learning. So Tolman tested this with 3 groups of rats, one of which did not receive reinforcement until the very end, and they still performed well. They had been learning the maze all along, they just had nothing to gain from showing that they learned the maze. So Tolman argued these rats were building mental maps, or mental representations of how a physical space is organized. This concept challenged some of the prevailing strict behavior models at the time. To many, this discovery falsified the notion that reinforcement was necessary for learning. It also put forth the idea that thinking, especially in the form of cognitive maps, plays a central role in at least some forms of learning. Researchers found that theta waves appear to play a role in forming cognitive maps. Fun fact. So, observational learning is where the phrase monkey see, monkey do comes from. This is considered a variant of latent learning because it does not require reinforcement, just observation. In most cases, we learn by watching models, like parents, teachers, and others who have an influence on us. This also makes it so we don't have to learn everything firsthand. So while some people do learn things better, like in a hands-on experience, it would be a burden to have to learn every single thing firsthand. So observational learning can also save us from life-threatening mistakes. So for example, if you see, let's say you're a kid, and you see your mom accidentally touch a hot stove or an oven, you see her yank away in pain, she starts saying expletives, you learn, okay, probably should not touch the hot stove or oven, it probably won't go well for me. This is also how people learn aggression as well. So one of the pioneer studies of aggression comes from Bandura. It was called the Bobo doll experiment. And the key findings were if kids saw an adult beating the doll, they would also beat the doll. If kids saw adults being nice to the doll, they would also be nice to the doll. That's where this little picture comes from. And on a related note, media violence and real-world aggression. So correlational studies have found a positive correlation between increased consumption of violent media and aggression in children. However, these results purely are correlational, they're not causal, so it's always best to kind of take them with a grain of salt. Other longitudinal studies found that those who watched more violent media committed more violent acts years later. Overall, the findings are kind of inconclusive. We have some in support, some kind of in support, some that could be argued as causal, some that aren't really causal. Some did not account for confounds, some failed to rule out rival hypotheses. So it's just really kind of up in the air. We don't really have a consensus on that just yet. Related are mirror neurons, which are cells in the prefrontal cortex that become activated when an animal performs an action or observes it being performed. These seem tuned to pretty specific behaviors. Some researchers believe they also play a role in empathy as well. So another area where conditioning can be applied are conditioned taste aversions. So this refers to the fact that classical conditioning can lead us to develop avoidance reactions to the taste of certain foods. So this does contradict what we know about classical conditioning in 3 ways. In contrast to most classically conditioned reactions, which require repeated pairings between conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, conditioned taste aversions typically only require one trial to develop. So, in other words, it only takes exposure to this horrible, horrible taste only one time instead of multiple times for a taste aversion to develop. The second one is the delay between conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus in conditioned taste aversions can be as long as 6 or even 8 hours. And the reason for this could simply be the amount of time it takes for food poisoning symptoms to set in. So if you get food poisoning, typically it's not going to be within the first hour or so. It may take up to 6 or 8 hours for the food poisoning to really kick in. Third, conditioned taste aversions tend to be remarkably specific and display little evidence of stimulus generalization. So I'll use myself an example here. So when I was younger, I got really, really horrible food poisoning from Long John Silver's, the fish. To this day, I won't eat it. Just the smell of it, just can't do it. Nope. And these make sense from an evolutionary standpoint. This helps us avoid food poisoning over and over from the same source or from similar sources. But it is a big problem for those undergoing chemotherapy. So health psychologists have patients eat an unfamiliar scapegoat food that they aren't fond of. And this challenges the idea of equipotentiality, which is the idea that we classically condition all conditioned stimuli equally well to all unconditioned stimuli. And of course, preparedness and phobias. This also challenges equipotentiality. People aren't the most afraid of things with which they've had the most unpleasant experiences. So Seligman believed this can be explained through preparedness, which is an evolutionary predisposition to learn some pairings of feared stimuli over others owing to their survival value. Like, even if you have had zero contact with a Bengal tiger ever, if you see one in the wild, you're going to be scared. Like, it's evolution. It's ingrained into us. And this may also lead us to develop illusory correlations between fear-provoking stimuli and negative consequences. Genetic influences also probably play a role here. Some people appear to be predisposed genetically to develop phobias, given a history of certain classical conditioning experiences. Relatedly, there's instinctive drift, which is the tendency for animals to return to innate behaviors following repeated reinforcement. All right, so learning fads. The first is sleep-assisted learning. The basic idea behind this is playing a recording like an audiobook while you sleep will help you learn. This is commonly done by people wanting to learn a new language who will listen to audio tapes in that language to try and learn it while they sleep. The early findings were encouraging, but they did fail to rule out an alternative explanation. The recordings used in these early studies might have woken patients up, in which case they wouldn't be learning while they're asleep, they'd be learning while they're awake. However, sleep can still help with learning. One study found that sleeping between study sessions can help people learn a new language. Second fad is accelerated learning. So the main kind is super learning and suggestive accelerated learning and teaching techniques, or SALLT. This supposedly helps people to pick up new information at anywhere from 25 to several hundred times faster than their normal learning speeds. This relies on several things like expectations, telling students they're going to learn more quickly, getting students to visualize the information they're learning, and breathing in a regular rhythm while learning. Almost all studies show this doesn't actually accelerate learning. Third kind is discovery learning. This is giving students experimental materials and asking them to figure out the scientific principles on their own. So several studies have shown that direct instructions, which is telling students how to solve problems, is usually more effective and more efficient than discovery learning. This isn't to say that there's no place for discovery learning in education. There is definitely a place for it. In fact, it can help students learn how to pose scientific questions in the long run. Fourth is learning styles. So this is an individual's preferred or optimal method of acquiring new information. Some people are analytical learners, some are more holistic learners. While these claims are nice to think about, research has shown that these findings aren't very reliable.